And again, just before I get going, I'd like to thank our colleagues in land remediation section for inviting us to participate and giving us the opportunity to tell you a little bit about what we do. So today, I want to give you an overview of our water quality guidelines in BC, how they're developed and how we use them. I'll start with an introduction to my group, and then go into a little bit more detail on the derivation of the guidelines, the application of the guidelines, and I'll finish up with a review of the available resources we have. Next slide, please. So the Water Quality Aquatic Science Unit, we're a small group, 6 biologists. We are within the Water Protection and Sustainability branch and the Environmental Sustainability Division in the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change Strategy. Our core responsibilities include the derivation of water quality guidelines. We oversee and guide the development of water quality objectives, and we are responsible for coordinating the provincial biomonitoring program. So this is a program which uses benthic invertebrate communities to assess the condition of aquatic ecosystems. Next slide, please. So a little overview of the guidelines and objectives. We've been doing these tools for close to 40 years now. They essentially define water quality in BC. They're environmental benchmarks that represent low risks to identified water uses and values. The guidelines apply generically on a provincial basis, and the objectives apply to specific water bodies for identified parameters of concern. They're used, both guidelines and objectives are used to inform environmental assessments and resource management decisions. They're policy statements with no direct legal standing on their own, but they can provide the basis for things like permit limits, which do have legal authority. And finally, once approved, they must be considered in any decision affecting water quality made within the Ministry of Environment. Next slide, please. So more specifically on guidelines, again, they represent low-risk conditions. We develop guidelines for a number of different water uses, including aquatic life, agriculture, wildlife, drinking water, and recreation. Most of our work focuses on aquatic life because they tend to be the most sensitive use, and so by protecting to that level, we're generally protecting other uses. Once approved, they are policy statements. For substances that we don't have approved guidelines for, we have working water quality guidelines, and we have working sediment quality guidelines. And those are adopted from other jurisdictions, including CCME and the US EPA. For drinking water and recreational guidelines, we generally adopt those from Health Canada, but where there's a need for a BC-specific guideline, we will work with our Ministry of Health to derive those numbers. Next slide, please. Thanks. The water quality guidelines and objectives are connected to the land remediation section in several respects. First, the guidelines are adopted and adapted to be CSR water standards. Most aquatic life standards are established by applying a 10-fold multiplier to a water quality guideline. Irrigation and livestock water standards in the CSR are also often adopted from the guideline. In addition, where a risk assessment involving an aquatic receiving environment is completed, water quality guidelines must be considered. One reason for this is that the director may consider an exceedance of the guideline to indicate the presence of pollution. As I previously said, the guidelines have no direct legal standing. However, they can be used to identify pollution under EMA at the discretion of a director. A certificate of compliance cannot be issued if a director suspects ongoing pollution of the aquatic receiving environment. And lastly, both guidelines and objectives are considered in waste discharge authorizations issued by the land remediation section. Objectives are used in this sense to determine cumulative impacts that might occur to a watershed. Next slide, please. So I mentioned that our work tends to focus on guidelines for aquatic life. And our goal within that is to protect the most sensitive species at the most sensitive life stage for an indefinite exposure. Our approved guidelines for aquatic life often include both long-term chronic guidelines and short-term acute guideline values. These represent the best estimate of predicted no-effect concentrations. The work is based on ecotoxicology studies and represent the best available information at the time of their derivation. We do have our guidance document online, and I'll touch on that again later on, but it's available online that describes exactly how we go about this. Next slide, please. So the work that we do in our unit is, with respect to guidelines, is driven by business needs. So we'll get input from our colleagues in Environmental Protection Division, the Impact Assessment Bios, who will flag parameters of concern that either need a guideline or need an existing guideline updated. It's driven also by the information available. For many substances, there just isn't a lot of science available. And then we'll also look for opportunities for collaboration, primarily with our colleagues at CCME. Once we decide to develop a new guideline or update an existing one, there's these 5 basic steps. We start with compiling the background information. So information on the substance of interest, background concentrations for BC, modes of toxicity, and so on. We'll review the toxicological literature, read the studies, gather the information, and then we'll compile the toxicity data. This includes the classification of the data and determining if there's enough to actually go forward with a derivation of a guideline. I'll provide a bit more detail on the derivation step in the next few slides. But once we have the guideline drafted, it'll go out for a review period. We'll do an internal review within government first, and then we'll go to an external review, generally for a 30-day period. We have an electronic distribution list that anyone can join. You just have to send us an email, you'll be added to it. And we also post it on our website. And then any input that's received is tracked and documented and considered and responded to or dealt with accordingly. If some new information has been brought to light, we may have to go back and do some more work. But all the data, all the input that is received is considered. So once we get to the final draft stage and we've completed that, it'll go to our executive in Water Sustainability Branch for approval, at which time it becomes official ministry policy and must be considered in any decisions affecting water quality made within the Ministry of Environment. Next page, please, or next slide, please. So when we're doing these, we're looking at toxicity modifying factors. And where there's sufficient information available, we will include these in the derivation of a guideline. They're sometimes quite simple. A range of hardness would be an example for different guideline values, and other ones are a little more complicated. There's several with equations, and more recently, with our copper guideline and currently our draft nickel guideline, we've used a biotic ligand model. So this enables us to actually take site-specific characteristics and apply it on the guideline, reducing the uncertainty associated with that estimate at a site. We do have several guideline documents with toxicity modifying factors involved, several metals, aluminum, cadmium, copper, lead, manganese and zinc. Our chlorophenols guideline, fluoride and sulfate guidelines include toxicity modifying factors, as do some of our nitrogen guidelines for ammonium and nitrite. Next slide, please. So just a little bit on data classification. When we compile the information and the data, it's because a study is published doesn't mean it's necessarily going to be included in the derivation. We have specific guidance on classifying data, and there's certain steps that go through. When a study is considered, it'll be classified as either primary or secondary or unacceptable. And there's certain aspects to this as to determine which classification the study will receive. Once that's done, then we have certain requirements, minimum data requirements for deriving a guideline. So for example, we have what we call a type A and a type B. I'll talk about those more in a sec. But for a type A1 guideline, we require 10 primary data points. For a type 2, we require 7 primary or secondary data points. And for a type B, we require 4 primary or secondary data points. And then there's certain requirements around species. So for example, the type A1 will require 10 primary studies, including fish, invertebrates, plants, and amphibians, whereas type A2 would require just the fish, the inverts, and the plants. So like I say, it's all documented, but there is quite specific requirements for the data classification, and then what we can use to move forward to derive a guideline. Next slide, please. So this is a type A. We'd use in a type A, species sensitivity distribution. It's a widely accepted approach among different jurisdictions, but there are differences in each jurisdiction's guiding principles. And so the point there is that an SSD just isn't an SSD as an SSD. It depends on which jurisdiction is deriving the guideline. So they can have quite different intent when you get into that. Basically what this is you collect the data points and it's fit through a statistical model. There are certain problems with this. It breaks some foundational assumptions of statistics. The samples aren't from a random population, and there's no theoretical reason to assume that all the species sensitivity data will follow a statistical distribution. But the long and the short of this is that we do plot the data, and from that we can extrapolate from that line what's called the HC5, the hazard concentration, that represents the cutoff point where 95% of those data or those species will be protected. In BC, we take another step at this point where we'll apply an assessment factor to that HC5 value to lower it to account for uncertainty associated with the estimate. And I'll talk about that a bit more in a couple slides. So this would be for the type A, type A1 or type A2. Next slide, please. And this is the type B guideline derivation approach, and this is what most of our guidelines have been developed on. In recent years, the SSD approach has become quite popular with a number of jurisdictions. So in BC, we've worked extremely hard to overcome some of the ecological and statistical issues we identified with the SSD approach, and we do have our own model now for that. But prior to that, this was the method that was used by both CCME and BC to derive water quality guidelines. And essentially what it does is just identify what we call the critical study, identified by that red circle. The most sensitive endpoint identified in the literature, and from there we would apply an assessment factor to account for the uncertainty and derive the final guideline number. Can I have the next slide, please? Thanks. So just a bit on the assessment factors. The assessment factors account for the uncertainty associated with it. So you can appreciate that, there's a picture of a toxicity test underway. There's several jars with a species of critter in there exposed to one contaminant, and measure the effects on that organism under different concentrations of a contaminant. So that's great from that point, but now you have to take that information and move it to the environment, and that's where the difficulty comes in. In the environment, organisms aren't exposed to single contaminants; they're exposed to a mixture of contaminants. There's a limited number of species available for these tests, so the range of data that is available is actually quite limited in comparison to the range of organisms found in the natural environment. And another point would be that the species, for example, rainbow trout, which is popular in tox tests, is not the same rainbow trout that's swimming around in the river. So how they're going to react is uncertain. And so to account for that uncertainty, before we finalize a guideline value, we apply an assessment factor. We divide that value by a number that is based on the confidence we have in the data used to derive the guideline. We use a minimum value of 2, but it can be quite a bit higher depending on the quality and quantity of the data. Next slide, please. So just a couple words on applying the guidelines. If you're looking at a guideline just simply to see if the water quality is meeting that guideline, then it's pretty straightforward. For the long-term chronic guidelines, we take an average of 5 weekly samples in a 30-day period, calculate the average and compare it to the guideline. If there's a toxicity modifying factor or factors, we could take the average of those and then do the same calculation to see if that guideline is being met. For short-term acute guidelines, these are intended to protect against severe effects from transient or episodic events like a spill. So all the values should be, the results should meet that guideline value. So it's pretty straightforward if you're just looking to assess a guideline or similarly an objective value, but where it gets a little more complicated is in the application for environmental assessment. So a lot of times if we're assessing the water quality for a given water body, looking at the guidelines, a lot of times the data is somewhat limited, or there's significant gaps in data, and so there's quite a bit of professional judgment that comes into play, and this would include understanding exactly what the guideline represents, maybe even going as far as to understand what those critical studies were for deriving that value, were the species that were used in deriving the guideline relevant to the site that you're considering. So there's a lot more that goes into it than just comparing one number to another number. Could I have the next slide, please? So, just to finish up on our resources, this is just a quick shot of our website, and over to the left, we can see the Ambient Water Quality Guidelines tab. Next slide, please. So on our guideline website, we've got all our resources available, and there's hot links to all of them. So this includes our water quality guideline policy statement. It includes our document on deriving aquatic life guidelines in BC. We've got some guideline tools. We have this guideline lookup table, which is an R-based application. You can go into this application, choose the substance you're interested in, choose the values you're interested in, so aquatic life or drinking water or agriculture uses, If there is a toxicity modifying factor, there'll be a spot to enter that, and then it gives you the value of the guideline that you're looking for. And it also provides you with links to the technical documents associated with that guideline. We also have guideline summary documents, so PDF documents that summarize all of our guidelines for aquatic life, wildlife, and agriculture. We have one for the drinking water sources and one for recreational uses. For under the aquatic life guidelines, for each guideline, there's a technical document and an overview report, and for some of the more recent ones, we've started to do users guides for those guidelines, so outlining exactly how you would use the guideline and any other technical information that would be required. I mentioned earlier, for substances that we don't have approved guidelines for, we have our working water quality guidelines. So we have a PDF document that lists all of the working water quality guidelines and the sediment quality guidelines. And then there's also a tab on our website for any draft guidelines that are up for review. So you can go into that and then provide comments on a draft guideline before they're finalized. Next slide, please. This is just a quick overview of the current projects our unit's involved in. We're updating our PAH guideline. We're developing a new nickel guideline, been working with the CCME on that one. And this one, like our copper guideline, is based on a biotic ligand model. And then we've been working for several years now on a hardness guideline. Is shifting now to a major ions guideline, and quite possibly we'll use specific conductivity as a surrogate in that one, but it's been a challenging project, but we are making headway there. For water quality objectives, we're currently updating Burrard Inlet objectives, working with the Tsleil-Waututh Nation on that one. We're updating our Similkameen River water quality objectives, working with the upper and lower Similkameen Indian bands on that. Columbia River water quality objectives update is ongoing. We're working with our colleagues in EPD on that one. Murray River up in Northeast BC, we're working with 3 Treaty 8 First Nations, McLeod Lake, Moberly Lake, West Moberly, and Soto First Nations on that project. And then finally, our Shuswap Lake objectives, working with the Indigenous nations in that area. This document is just about near completion. We'll be going out for public review shortly. Next slide, please. So just to summarize a couple points, our guidelines and objectives are policy statements. They represent low-risk conditions for water uses and values. So they're not standards, they're policy, but they can be adopted as standards and under various legislation and tools. The guidelines for the protection of aquatic life are generally the most conservative, but I want to emphasize there is uncertainty associated with those estimates, and so there is a large degree of professional judgment that's required to properly apply them and use them in assessment work. And finally, all the information needed is available in our online resources, and there are connections to our guideline specialists within the unit if specific questions or help is needed. And I think that is it. Next slide.